He was a battle-hardened military veteran who brought absolute, unyielding realism to an industry built entirely on illusions. But when Perry Saturn stepped onto the grandest stage of a billion-dollar wrestling empire, his elite technical brilliance became his ultimate curse. Instead of rewarding his blood and sacrifice, a toxic syndicate of aging executives hijacked his talent, using him as a human shield to cover up the flaws of incompetent, politically connected stars. When he refused to quietly accept the injustice, the establishment systematically stripped away his dignity, forcing a legitimate warrior to perform deeply degrading stunts just to protect their fragile locker room egos. The sheer cruelty of this corporate betrayal only makes sense when unearthing the ironclad military discipline that originally forged his psychology. Born Perry Saturn in October 1966 in Cleveland, Ohio, his early life was entirely devoid of the glamorous, preening theatrics usually associated with sports entertainment. He did not grow up aspiring to be a television star. He grew up looking for structure and survival. At the age of 17, Saturn enlisted in the United States Army. He did not merely serve a standard tour. He pushed himself to the absolute physical and mental limits of human endurance, ultimately graduating to become an airborne ranger. For 4 formative years, his entire worldview was constructed within a culture defined by a strict chain of command, relentless physical punishment, and a profound sense of brotherhood. In the military, competence is not a buzzword. It is a matter of life and death. You earn your rank through undeniable merit. You protect the men standing beside you, and you respect the hierarchy because it is built on proven, blood-tested leadership. The military hardwires a specific moral compass into a man's brain. Hard work equals respect, and incompetence is a lethal liability that must be eradicated. When Saturn eventually transitioned into the world of professional wrestling in the late 1980s, he carried this militant philosophy directly into the squared circle. He trained under the legendary Walter Killer Kowalski in Malden, Massachusetts. Kowalski was a notoriously brutal old-school taskmaster who did not tolerate laziness, fragility, or theatrical whining. Under Kowalski's heavy hands, Saturn did not just learn how to execute a script. He learned the rigid, unforgiving mechanics of the craft. He learned the physics of leverage, how to fall on rigid wood without shattering his spine, how to strike with brutal realism, and, crucially, how to protect his opponent. He became what the industry refers to as a mechanic. A mechanic is a highly skilled technician who can step into the ring with absolutely anyone, regardless of the opponent's skill level, and seamlessly engineer a credible, compelling contest. A mechanic does not complain. A mechanic fixes the broken parts of the match and makes the company look good. Saturn's early career in the mid-1990s was defined by his tenure in Extreme Championship Wrestling, teaming with the highly athletic John Cronus as the Eliminators. Saturn found an environment that suited his temperament perfectly. ECW was a gritty, rebellious, blue-collar promotion operating out of a dingy bingo hall in South Philadelphia. It was a company that lacked financial resources but thrived on pure, unadulterated effort. The audience in Philadelphia did not care about Hollywood aesthetics or million-dollar smiles. They cared about violence, authenticity, and relentless work rate. Saturn delivered exactly that. He was an absolute machine. In one infamous instance that perfectly encapsulates his mindset, Saturn suffered a completely torn ACL in his knee during a match. For a professional athlete, a torn ACL is a catastrophic, agonizing injury that immediately mandates surgery and a year of rehabilitation. Saturn, however, refused to stop. He taped the knee, altered his style, and remarkably continued to wrestle on a destroyed joint for months, refusing to let the company or his tag team partner down. In the ecosystem of ECW, blood and sweat were the primary currencies, and Saturn was a very wealthy man. The audience respected the sacrifice, and the promoter, Paul Heyman, valued his dedication. Saturn's military worldview was validated. He suffered for the platoon, and the platoon respected him for it. But the human body is a finite resource, and professional wrestling collects a heavy tax on bone and cartilage. By 1997, seeking the financial security that a battered body inevitably demands, Saturn signed a lucrative contract with World Championship Wrestling. He believed he was taking the logical next step in his career. He was moving from the minor leagues to the absolute pinnacle of the industry. WCW was the polar opposite of the bingo hall in Philadelphia. Backed by the limitless billions of media mogul Ted Turner, UCW was a corporate juggernaut operating out of Atlanta, Georgia. It was generating massive global television ratings, filling stadiums, and paying exorbitant guaranteed salaries. Saturn walked through the glass doors of the corporate headquarters, expecting to ply his trade on the grandest stage. He assumed that his elite skill set, his military discipline, and his tireless work ethic would naturally propel him up the corporate ladder. Instead, the former Army Ranger walked into an absolute political quagmire. The culture of WCW in 1997 was not a meritocracy. It was a deeply entrenched, toxic aristocracy. The company was entirely dominated by a syndicate of highly paid, aging veterans from the 1980s, men like Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash. These men wielded immense backstage influence and held contractual clauses that gave them absolute creative control over their own storylines. They decided who won, who lost, and who was allowed to be featured on television. The management structure, led by executive Eric Bischoff, was utterly compromised. The executives were far more interested in appeasing these megastars and managing their fragile egos than building a sustainable merit-based roster. It was an environment that valued fame and political leverage entirely over athletic substance. For a man like Perry Saturn, the culture shock was profound and immediately destabilizing. He was accustomed to a world where respect was earned on the canvas, measured by the quality of the performance. In WCW, he quickly realized that respect was distributed in the executive suites and on the golf courses. The executives did not look at Saturn's flawless execution, his intense physical presence, or his devastating finishing maneuver, a brutal submission hold known as the Rings of Saturn, and see a future world champion. They looked at his average height, his lack of Hollywood glamour, and his quiet demeanor, and they saw a utility player. They saw a man who didn't play the political games behind the curtain, a man who simply clocked in, did his job, and went back to his hotel room. In the eyes of a corrupt management team, a quiet, hyper-competent worker is not viewed as an asset to be promoted and celebrated. They are viewed as a tool to be exploited. Almost immediately, the WCW power brokers began to weaponize Saturn's talent against his own career trajectory. because the company had invested tens of millions of dollars in main event stars who were often physically declining, highly immobile, or simply lacking in fundamental wrestling skills. Management faced a distinct, terrifying logistical problem. How do you make a terrible aging wrestler look like a dangerous, explosive superstar on live television without exposing his flaws to the audience? The answer was the middle class of workers. The answer was Perry Saturn. Saturn was thrust into the role of the ultimate supporting cast member. The booking committee routinely paired him with the company's bloated, politically protected investments. His job was to step into the ring, use his elite technical prowess to hide their glaring flaws, dictate the pace of the match to protect their cardiovascular limitations, take the absolute brunt of the physical punishment, and ultimately lose the contest. He was ordered to make the incompetent star look like a conquering hero. He was the master craftsman commanded to build a magnificent pedestal, only to be forced to stand in the shadows, while a hollow plastic statue was placed upon it to receive applause. While outsiders might dismiss this as simply the nature of the entertainment business, where Saturn was paid a handsome six-figure salary to play a designated role for a man with his military pride, this dynamic was an intricate daily form of psychological torture. Professional wrestling requires immense physical sacrifice and a deep, unspoken trust between the two men in the ring. When you are a master of that craft, being repeatedly ordered to dilute your own skills, to slow down, and to accommodate the laziness of a man who earns 5 times your salary breeds a very specific, corrosive type of resentment. Saturn was watching the fundamental rules of his universe being inverted. In the military, the strongest carry the team forward, and the weak are either trained up or removed. In WCW, the strongest were being used as human shields to protect the weakest egos in the building. Saturn was bleeding to cover up the inadequacies of men who did not respect the business. He was part of a highly skilled cohort of wrestlers, men like Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, and Dean Malenko, who were all suffering the exact same indignity. They were the engine of the company, but the executives only cared about the hood ornament. As the calendar rolled toward 1998, the quiet, obedient soldier within Perry Saturn began to die, replaced by a dark, simmering rage. The trauma of systemic unappreciation was taking root, and the breaking point was rapidly approaching. The illusion of progress in a toxic corporate environment is often more psychologically damaging than outright stagnation. When management throws a frustrated worker a bone, it momentarily reignites their hope, tricking them into believing that hard work is finally being recognized. But when that bone is revealed to be a leash, the resulting disillusionment is devastating. For Perry Saturn, this illusion arrived in 1998 in the form of a faction called the Flock. Led by the brooding, manipulative character Raven, the Flock was a group of societal outcasts and grunge-era misfits who sat in the front row of the arena, violently interfering in matches. For a former airborne ranger who thrived in unit-based brotherhoods, this assignment initially felt like a reprieve. It was a clear, defined role. Saturn functioned as the faction's heavily tattooed silent enforcer. He was the muscle, the mechanic who executed the tactical orders. The audience responded organically to his terrifying intensity, and his matches became a rare highlight on a television program, otherwise suffocated by the aging stars of the New World Order, NWO. But the fundamental architecture of World Championship Wrestling had not changed. The flock was never designed to be a main event attraction. It was designed to be a mid-card distraction. When Saturn inevitably broke away from the group to embark on a solo career, he believed he had finally earned his spot at the grown-ups table. He was delivering the most physically intense, technically flawless performances in the company. He assumed his ascension was imminent. Instead, he encountered the most insidious weapon a corrupt management structure can deploy against a high-performing employee, the glass ceiling of humiliation. By 1998, the WCW executives were facing a severe problem. The billionaire-funded roster was bloated, and the veteran stars who controlled the political landscape refused to work competitive matches. To fill the 3 hours of live television every week, management needed the highly skilled middle class of wrestlers to carry the workload. But they could not allow these workers to become too popular, lest they threaten the established hierarchy. Therefore, a chilling strategy was implemented. Management would give the skilled workers television time, but they would saddle them with deeply humiliating storylines designed to undermine their credibility. This corporate strategy culminated in one of the most traumatizing chapters of his career. In a feud with the flamboyant Chris Jericho, the booking committee devised a stipulation. The loser of their upcoming match would be forced to wear a dress on television for 90 days. It was a classic, cheap booking tactic intended to generate a quick laugh. Unsurprisingly, the political machinery dictated that Saturn, the stoic, heavily tattooed, legitimate tough guy, would lose the match. The intent from the executives was clear. They wanted to strip the airborne ranger of his dignity. They wanted to take the dangerous mechanic and turn him into a walking punchline, permanently capping his value as a serious main event threat. For an athlete whose entire identity is built on legitimate toughness, being ordered to walk out to a wrestling ring in front of millions of viewers wearing a floral dress is a profound insult. It is the corporate equivalent of forcing your top-performing engineer to wear a clown nose in a board meeting just to entertain the CEO. It is designed to break your spirit. But the executives fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of the man they were trying to break. They forgot they were dealing with a soldier. In the military, when a superior officer gives you an order, no matter how absurd, unpleasant, or degrading it may seem, you do not complain. You execute the order to the absolute best of your ability. Saturn absorbed the humiliation, put on the dress, and walked out to the ring. Then, he did something that absolutely terrified the management. He made it work. Saturn did not alter his aggressive, violent in-ring style. He stepped between the ropes wearing a dress and proceeded to mercilessly beat his opponents into unconsciousness. The visual dissonance was magnificent. He embraced the absurdity with such intense, unblinking commitment that the audience could not help but rally behind him. The fans saw right through the corporate attempt to humiliate him. They recognized his professionalism. Instead of laughing at him, they cheered for him louder than ever before. Saturn took a corporate execution sentence and forged it into a triumph. In a healthy corporate culture, a worker who takes a terrible idea from management and miraculously turns it into a profitable success is heavily rewarded. But WCW was not a healthy culture. It was a dictatorship of fragile egos. When Saturn got the dress gimmick over with the audience, management did not view it as a victory for the company. They viewed it as an act of insubordination. Saturn had survived the humiliation, and in doing so, he had inadvertently highlighted the incompetence of the men writing the scripts. He proved that his raw talent was more powerful than their political sabotage. The retaliation from the booking committee was swift and suffocating. Rather than capitalizing on his surging organic popularity, they actively cooled him down. They pulled his television time. They placed him in meaningless tag team matches that led nowhere. They instructed the commentary team to talk about the veteran stars, who were not even in the building, while Saturn was risking his neck in the ring. It was a deliberate, calculated burial. This is the exact point where the trauma of the modern worker solidifies. The frustration was no longer about a lack of opportunity. It was about the active, malicious suppression of excellence. Saturn realized that no amount of hard work, no amount of physical sacrifice, and no amount of crowd reaction would ever change his status. The system was rigged. The house always won, and the house was managed by men who despised the very concept of merit. As 1998 bled into 1999, the internal atmosphere of World Championship Wrestling descended from a toxic aristocracy into absolute anarchy. The television ratings began to plummet as audiences grew utterly exhausted by the aging veterans who refused to surrender the spotlight. In a blind panic, corporate executives at Time Warner began firing managers and hiring new creative directors, searching for a miraculous fix. They eventually hired Vince Russo, a writer from the rival World Wrestling Federation who was famous for Crash TV, a frantic, disjointed style of television that prioritized shocking soap opera storylines over actual wrestling. For a purist like Perry Saturn, this was the final death knell of his dignity. Under the new regime, the actual craft of professional wrestling was entirely devalued. The ring became merely a prop for convoluted backstage melodramas. Saturn, a man who had trained under Killer Kowalski to be a master of the canvas, found himself trapped in a circus where the clowns were in charge. He was forced into storylines that insulted his intelligence and the intelligence of the audience. The physical pain of his accumulating injuries, the aching joints, the concussions, the torn muscles, began to feel entirely pointless. Why destroy your body to perfect a suplex when the executives only care about who is hitting whom with a fake guitar behind the referee's back? The psychological isolation of this period was immense. Saturn was a man without a country. He was earning a massive corporate salary, yet he felt entirely hollow. The pride he took in his craftsmanship was being eroded daily by an employer that treated his life's work as a disposable joke. But he was not suffering in total isolation. In the locker rooms, in the sterile airport terminals, and during the long, exhausting drives down the endless American highways, Saturn found a brotherhood of shared misery. He gravitated toward a small, tight-knit group of men who shared his exact pedigree and his exact trauma. These men were Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, and Dean Malenko. Like Saturn, they were widely considered by their peers to be among the greatest in-ring performers on the planet. Like Saturn, They were highly disciplined, fiercely proud technicians, and like Saturn, they had been systematically marginalized, humiliated, and financially suppressed by the veteran clique that controlled WCW. They became the disillusioned middle class of the wrestling industry. They would sit in rental cars late at night, nursing their bruises and dissect the absolute lunacy of the company they worked for. They watched the veterans stumble through terrible matches, collect massive bonuses, and exert their political power to ensure the younger, faster men never broke through the glass ceiling. This shared trauma forged a profound, unbreakable bond between the four men. They were soldiers pinned down in a trench, watching their generals deliberately sabotage the war effort from the safety of a luxury box. The anger they felt was no longer just professional frustration, it was a deeply personal moral outrage. They realized that staying in WCW was not just detrimental to their careers, it was an active betrayal of their own self-respect. As the year 1999 drew to a close, the financial and creative collapse of WCW accelerated into a terrifying freefall. The company was losing millions of dollars, yet the management stubbornly refused to change the hierarchy. The atmosphere in the locker room became incredibly volatile, heavily policed by paranoia and resentment. Perry Saturn, the quiet mechanic, had reached his absolute limit. The military discipline that had taught him to swallow his pride and follow orders had finally been exhausted. He looked at the scars on his body. He looked at the men in the rental car beside him, and he realized that a corporate contract, no matter how lucrative, is never worth the price of your soul. A decision was crystallizing in the dark corners of the WCW locker room, a decision that would require them to risk everything they had built, and a decision that would ultimately deliver a devastating, fatal blow to the empire that had abused them. There is a specific, terrifying threshold that every abused worker eventually reaches. It is the moment when the fear of the unknown is finally eclipsed by the absolute certainty that staying will destroy you. In the corporate world, employees will endure staggering amounts of disrespect, passed over promotions, and incompetent management as long as the paycheck clears. Security is a powerful narcotic, but when a system systematically strips away your professional dignity, day after day, year after year, that security morphs into a prison. For Perry Saturn and his small brotherhood of elite technicians, the winter of 1999 in World Championship Wrestling was the freezing point of their careers. They had reached the threshold, and they were preparing to jump into the dark. The magnitude of their impending defection is underscored by the financial reality of the era. Ted Turner's WCW handed out guaranteed contracts that were unprecedented in the history of the industry. For a man like Saturn, a former soldier whose body was a roadmap of surgical scars and accumulating kinetic trauma, a guaranteed six-figure salary was a vital lifeline. It meant his family was secure, regardless of whether he wrestled in the main event or was humiliated in the mid-card. Walking away from that contract meant abandoning financial certainty. It meant breaching a legal agreement with a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate that possessed a fleet of corporate lawyers. In the wrestling business, where a single awkward landing can end a career instantly, voluntarily tearing up a guaranteed contract is considered an act of financial insanity. But the psychological rot within WCW had become terminal. The executives in charge were blind to the mounting resentment. They operated under the arrogant assumption that they could buy compliance. They believed that no matter how severely they abused the middle class of their roster, the money would keep them tethered to the machine. Management assumed that men like Saturn lacked the leverage and the courage to actually walk out the door. It was a fatal miscalculation born of extreme corporate hubris. The catalyst for the ultimate breaking point arrived in January 2000. In another desperate, frantic attempt to halt their plummeting television ratings, WCW management made a sweeping change to their creative hierarchy. They appointed a veteran named Kevin Sullivan to the position of a head booker. For the average television viewer, this was merely a reshuffling of backstage personnel. But for the locker room, it was a devastating declaration of war. Kevin Sullivan was the absolute embodiment of the old boys club. He was a deeply entrenched member of the veteran political network that had spent years holding the younger generation down. More critically, Sullivan had a notoriously hostile, highly personal history with Chris Benoit. Appointing Sullivan as the absolute authority over the careers of Benoit, Saturn, Guerrero, and Malenko sent a chilling, undeniable message. The glass ceiling had just been reinforced with concrete. The executives were telling their most talented workers that merit would never matter, that the political hierarchy was permanent, and that their careers would now be dictated by the very men who actively despised them. For Perry Saturn, the appointment of Sullivan was the final indisputable proof that WCW was a lost cause. He watched his close friend Chris Benoit, arguably the best in-ring performer alive at the time, being backed into a corner by vindictive corporate politics. This is where Saturn's military background dictated his actions. In the Airborne Rangers, you do not abandon a man in your unit when the commanding officers turn against him. You do not quietly keep your head down and collect your rations while your brother is being led to the slaughter. Loyalty to the platoon supersedes loyalty to a corrupt command structure. The four men convened. They did not plot a negotiation. They plotted an exodus. They decided collectively that they would approach WCW management and demand an unconditional release from their lucrative contracts. They were not bluffing, and they were not asking for more money. They wanted their freedom. They were willing to trade the guaranteed wealth of Ted Turner for the terrifying uncertainty of the open market, banking entirely on their raw talent to survive. The resulting confrontation with WCW management is the stuff of industry legend, a scene that perfectly encapsulates the supreme arrogance of a dying corporate empire. The four men sat down with Bill Bush, a corporate executive brought in by Time Warner to manage the chaos. They laid their demands on the table. Bush, completely failing to understand the resolve of the men sitting across from him, attempted to apply leverage. He tried to divide and conquer. He offered Chris Benoit the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, a desperate hollow bribe designed to break the solidarity of the group. They placed the belt on Benoit at the sold-out pay-per-view on January 16th, 2000. Management assumed that the allure of the industry's ultimate prize would shatter the rebellion, bribing Benoit into compliance while leaving Saturn, Guerrero, and Malenko to fall back in line. But a corporate bribe cannot cure a moral injury. The next morning, Benoit walked into the arena, handed the World Heavyweight Championship back to the executives and told them he was leaving. Saturn, Malenko, and Guerrero stood shoulder to shoulder with him. They had called the billionaire empire's bluff. The executives, blinded by their own ego, finally relented. Furious and humiliated by the insubordination, management granted the unconditional releases, assuming these four mid-carders would quickly fade into obscurity without the WCW television machine behind them. It was without a doubt one of the most disastrous personnel decisions in the history of corporate entertainment. When Perry Saturn packed his gear bag and walked out of the arena that day, he was not just leaving a job, he was participating in a catastrophic brain drain that would ultimately kill World Championship Wrestling. The departure of the Radicals, as they would soon be known, gutted the WCW roster of its actual working talent. The executives were left holding a roster of expensive, immobile veterans and a television product that had entirely lost its athletic credibility. Saturn and his brothers had detonated the foundation of the company on their way out the door. The sheer audacity of the move sent shockwaves through the industry. In a business built on protecting your own spot, four men had effectively unionized themselves. They had weaponized their solidarity. For Saturn, it was a moment of profound psychological liberation. He had spent 3 years swallowing his pride, executing terrible scripts, and wearing literal dresses to appease the fragile egos of incompetent men. By walking out, he reclaimed his dignity. He proved that he was not a tool to be exploited, but a master craftsman who owned the rights to his own labor. But liberation is often followed by immediate peril. They were now unemployed in an industry that had rapidly consolidated into a two-horse race. Their only viable destination was the rival World Wrestling Federation, run by the notoriously ruthless Vince McMahon. They had no guarantee that McMahon would hire them, and even if he did, they had no guarantee that the political environment in Stamford, Connecticut would be any less toxic than the one they had just fled in Atlanta, Georgia. On January 31st, 2000, just 2 weeks after walking out of WCW, Perry Saturn, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko appeared on WWF Monday Night Raw. They did not make a grand theatrical entrance. They simply walked down the aisle as civilians and sat together in the front row of the audience. The arena erupted. The television audience understood exactly what they were witnessing. It was a visual defection of the highest order. The WWF commentators immediately acknowledged them on air, treating their arrival not as a minor acquisition, but as a monumental shift in the balance of power in the Monday Night Wars. Vince McMahon had capitalized on WCW's arrogance. He recognized that Saturn and his cohort were the undisputed workhorses of the industry, and he immediately signed them to contracts. For a brief shining moment, the trauma of the past 3 years seemed to evaporate. They were no longer the suppressed middle class. They were the invading force, heavily featured on the most watched wrestling program on the planet. Saturn was allowed to showcase his aggressive military precision style against a fresh roster of opponents. The mechanic was finally being allowed to operate at full capacity. Yet, corporate cultures, even highly successful ones, possess their own unique brands of cruelty. The World Wrestling Federation was a meritocracy, but it was a ruthless, hyper-political meritocracy governed by the chaotic whims of one billionaire owner. while Saturn had successfully escaped the stagnant aristocracy of WCW. He was about to discover that the trauma he carried with him, the years of systemic disrespect, and the physical toll of his relentless style could not simply be erased by a change of scenery. The corporate machine had changed its logo, but it had not lost its appetite for chewing up its most dedicated soldiers. Perry Saturn had won his freedom, but the most bizarre, degrading, and ultimately tragic chapter of his professional life was only just beginning to unfold. The euphoria of escaping a toxic workplace is a powerful, intoxicating drug. When you finally walk out the doors of an empire that has spent years systematically crushing your spirit, the immediate rush of adrenaline tricks you into believing that the war is over. When Perry Saturn and his brothers Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko arrived on World Wrestling Federation television in early 2000, they were hailed as conquering heroes. They had defected from the failing aristocracy of World Championship Wrestling and had been welcomed into the arms of the victorious, hyper-efficient corporate machine run by Vince McMahon. For the first few months, the illusion held perfectly. Saturn was surrounded by an electric atmosphere. The WWF in the year 2000 was the hottest entertainment property on the planet, generating record-breaking profits. It operated as a ruthless, cutthroat meritocracy. If you could generate a reaction from the crowd, McMahon would put you on television. There were no aging veterans holding contractual veto power over the scripts. For a brief, shining window, Saturn was allowed to be the aggressive, technically flawless mechanic he had trained to be. He won the European Championship. He was featured in prominent, hard-hitting matches. He felt finally that his elite craftsmanship was being respected. But changing your employer does not erase the trauma you carry, nor does it alter the fundamental nature of the industry you serve. As the honeymoon phase faded, the grim reality of the WWF corporate structure began to reveal itself. While WCW had been a bloated aristocracy that paid wrestlers to do nothing, the WWF was a hyper-capitalist meat grinder that demanded absolute, unrelenting physical sacrifice. The travel schedule was brutal. 300 days a year on the road, sleeping in cheap motels, driving hundreds of miles through the night, and performing through agonizing injuries. Furthermore, Saturn soon realized that his corporate classification had not changed. He had crossed enemy lines, but he was still viewed by upper management as a utility player. He was not selected to be the face of the franchise. Once again, his role was to be the reliable engine in the background. His job was to use his masterful technical skills to elevate the younger, more cosmetically appealing stars that the company was grooming for the main event. For a man in his mid-30s, whose body had absorbed over a decade of severe kinetic trauma, this realization was a heavy psychological blow. He was back on the factory floor, doing the heavy lifting, watching other men receive the executive promotions. The frustration that had driven him out of Atlanta began to quietly pool in the back of his mind in Stanford. But this time, the frustration was compounded by severe, chronic physical pain. Years of diving onto concrete, landing on his neck, and wrestling through torn ligaments were demanding payment. To survive the grueling schedule and numb the physical agony, Saturn, like many of his peers in that era, began walking a dangerous, chemical tightrope just to make it to the ring each night. This is the pressure cooker that sets the stage for one of the most infamous, misunderstood incidents in modern wrestling history. It is a moment that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying breaking point of a highly skilled, deeply exhausted worker. In May 2001, the WWF was filming a secondary television program called Jackhead. Saturn was booked in a routine match against a developmental talent named Mike Bell. Bell was essentially an apprentice, a lower-tier wrestler brought in to lose to the established stars. For a master mechanic like Saturn, this should have been a standard, effortless day at the office. But professional wrestling requires an absolute, unbreakable physical trust. When you allow a man to lift you off the ground, you are trusting him with your life. You are trusting that he possesses the competence to protect your neck when you fall. A few minutes into the match, Mike Bell executed a sloppy maneuver, clumsily dropping Saturn onto his head and neck. In a business where absolute physical trust is paramount, an error like this can end a career or put a man in a wheelchair. But instead of protecting the match, the pressure cooker of Saturn's accumulated trauma exploded. He snapped. He broke character, aggressively attacking Bell with legitimate, unscripted strikes, and recklessly threw him into the steel steps. It was a severe, highly unprofessional breach of conduct. The footage is uncomfortable to watch. It is the raw, unfiltered manifestation of a man whose physical agony and professional patience had violently boiled over. In the corporate world, if you physically assault a junior colleague, you are immediately fired and likely face criminal charges. But the wrestling industry operates on a warped set of internal laws. When Saturn returned to the locker room, the management did not fire him. Vince McMahon, a man notorious for his complex, often cruel sense of humor, decided that firing Saturn was too easy. Instead, McMahon chose a path of deliberate, televised corporate punishment. He decided to break Saturn's pride. The executives called Saturn into the office and handed him his new creative direction. As punishment for losing his temper, the legitimate tough guy, the former airborne ranger, the elite submission specialist, was ordered to suffer a fictional traumatic brain injury. His new character would be a bumbling, cross-eyed fool who could only speak in gibberish. And to complete the humiliation, he was ordered to fall deeply, romantically in love with an ordinary floor mop. He was to carry this mop to the ring, talk to it, and treat it as his soulmate. They called the mop Moppy. It was an act of breathtaking corporate cruelty. The executives were using their global television platform to actively degrade their own employee. They were taking a man who had dedicated his life to the serious physical craft of wrestling and forcing him to act out a degrading pantomime. It was the WCW dress gimmick all over again, but magnified by a factor of 10. The message from management was absolute. You do not step out of line. We own your dignity, and we will make a mockery of your life's work if you defy us. Faced with this order, a lesser man would have quit. Many wrestlers would have refused, breached their contracts, and walked away from the industry entirely. But the military discipline ingrained in Perry Saturn's DNA took over. When the commanding officer hands down a punishment, you take it on the chin. Saturn accepted the script. In a surreal twist, the audience completely embraced his heartbreaking commitment to the absurdity. Moppy became a massive merchandise-moving phenomenon. Yet, while the fans cheered for the mop, the man holding it was dying inside. The unexpected success generated money for the company, but it completely eradicated any remaining credibility Saturn had as a serious, dangerous athlete. He was entertaining the masses at the expense of his own professional soul. Worse still, the physical toll had finally breached a critical limit. In 2002, Saturn suffered another severe injury, completely tearing his ACL for the second time. The human body, no matter how disciplined, eventually issues an eviction notice. Saturn was forced out of the ring to undergo major reconstructive surgery. While he was recovering at home, isolated from the adrenaline of the crowd and the brotherhood of the locker room, the World Wrestling Federation made a quiet, sterile corporate decision. They looked at their spreadsheets, noted that Saturn was aging, injured, and saddled with a comedy gimmick that had run its course. They decided he was no longer a profitable asset. In November 2002, Perry Saturn was unceremoniously released from his contract. The master mechanic, the soldier who had bled for 2 different billionaire empires, was quietly discarded. The sudden loss of his career, his identity, and his daily structure triggered a devastating psychological collapse. Perry Saturn was about to fall into a darkness far more terrifying than any corporate boardroom or political locker room. He was about to disappear entirely from the face of the earth, embarking on a harrowing descent into the true underworld, where the demons were no longer executives in suits, but the ghosts of his own trauma. The most dangerous moment in the life of a professional soldier does not occur on the battlefield. It occurs on the day he is finally sent home. When the artillery falls silent, when the chain of command dissolves, and when the daily singular objective of survival is removed, a terrifying psychological void opens up. For a man who has been entirely institutionalized, first by the rigid structure of the United States Army, and then by the traveling circus of the professional wrestling industry, the sudden arrival of silence is a highly lethal threat. In November 2002, when the World Wrestling Federation unceremoniously released Perry Saturn from his contract, they did not just take away his income, they stripped him of his daily purpose. For 15 years, his entire identity had been constructed around his physical utility. He was the master mechanic. He was the enforcer. He was the man who could endure an ungodly amount of physical punishment and still hit his mark on live television. But suddenly, sitting in a quiet house with a reconstructed knee, he was nobody. The catastrophic spiral that followed was entirely predictable within the bleak reality of the wrestling industry at the turn of the millennium. Unlike athletes in major professional sports leagues, professional wrestlers are classified as independent contractors. When Saturn was fired, there was no corporate pension waiting for him. There was no severance package. There was no comprehensive medical insurance provided by the billionaire executives who had profited from his destruction. And there certainly was no psychological transition program. You are simply handed your final check and shown the door. You are left entirely alone to manage the physical wreckage of your career. And the physical wreckage for Saturn was profound. His body was a monument to kinetic trauma. His joints were ground to dust. His spine had absorbed the impact of 1,000 concrete floors. But the most insidious damage was invisible. To survive the brutal 300-day-a-year travel schedules and to numb the agony of performing with torn ligaments, Saturn had developed a severe dependency on prescription painkillers. In the corporate locker rooms of that era, opioids were not viewed as a vice. They were an absolute occupational necessity. They were the only way to ensure the workers could clock in for the next shift. But when the job ends, the physical pain does not. Without the massive corporate salary to fund his prescriptions, Saturn's chemical dependency began to warp. The quiet desperation of his forced retirement was slowly consuming him. Yet the event that finally pushed him over the edge into absolute darkness was not a corporate betrayal, nor was it a wrestling injury. It was an act of profound real-world heroism that perfectly illuminated the immense gap between the man Perry Saturn actually was and the clown the wrestling executives had tried to make him. In April 2004, Saturn was driving through a dangerous neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. He was running an errand, living a quiet, civilian life. As he stopped his vehicle, he witnessed a horrifying scene. A man was violently assaulting a woman, attempting to drag her into an alleyway. In modern society, the bystander effect is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Most people, when confronted with sudden violent crime, will freeze, look away, or wait for someone else to intervene. But Perry Saturn was an airborne ranger. The military does not train you to look away. It trains you to move aggressively toward the threat. The corporate executives in Stanford had spent a year trying to convince the world that Saturn was a brain-damaged fool who loved a floor mop. But in that desperate moment on the streets of Atlanta, his true pedigree took over. Saturn did not hesitate. He exited his vehicle and physically engaged the attacker. He fought the man off, successfully saving the woman from a horrific fate. But heroism in the real world rarely ends with a clean fade to black. During the physical struggle, a second assailant, unseen by Saturn, approached and drew a handgun. Saturn was shot in the back of the neck and then shot a second time in the right shoulder. He survived the assassination attempt, but the physical and psychological toll of the shooting was the final fatal blow to his stability. He was rushed to the hospital, where he was pumped full of the very narcotic painkillers he had been struggling to escape. The bullets had caused severe nerve damage, exacerbating the agony of his existing wrestling injuries. The medical bills began to mount. The sheer trauma of surviving a murder attempt, combined with the loss of his career and the total absence of a corporate safety net, shattered his mind. When the legal prescriptions eventually ran out, Saturn was trapped in a state of unbearable physical and mental agony, desperate to numb the pain and entirely disillusioned with a society that seemed to punish him for doing the right thing. He turned to the street. He discovered methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a drug of pure mechanical velocity. It eradicates physical exhaustion and blunts emotional trauma, replacing it with a frantic, paranoid energy. For a man trying to outrun the ghosts of his past and the pain in his neck, it was a terrifyingly effective solution. The addiction took hold with violent speed. Within a matter of months, the millions of dollars he had earned in the wrestling business evaporated. His home was foreclosed. His marriage disintegrated. Perry Saturn, the elite craftsman who had wrestled on the international television in front of millions of screaming fans, became a ghost. He slipped completely off the grid. For nearly 2.5 years, Saturn was entirely homeless. He lived on the brutal, unforgiving streets of the American Midwest. He slept under bridges, scavenged for food, and existed in a state of perpetual drug-induced paranoia. In the wrestling industry, rumors began to circulate that he was dead. His family could not find him. His closest friends from the locker room, the men he had shared rental cars and revolutions with, had absolutely no idea if he was alive. He had been completely swallowed by the underworld. This period of his life forces us to confront a highly uncomfortable, heavily debated reality regarding the corporate ethics of the sports entertainment industry. How does a man who generated vast wealth for two different billionaire empires end up starving on the street just a few years later? The executives and corporate defenders will argue the doctrine of personal responsibility. They will state that Saturn was an adult, that he made his own choices, and that the company cannot be held responsible for the private, illegal drug use of a former contractor. From a strictly legal standpoint, they are correct. But from a moral standpoint, this argument is deeply cowardly. The executives created an environment that demanded an impossible physical standard. They knowingly profited from an unwritten culture where severe pain medication was required to maintain the schedule they dictated. They weaponized Saturn's dignity, humiliated him on television, and discarded him the moment his body broke down under their demands. To wash their hands of the fallout, to claim ignorance when the inevitable psychological collapse occurs, is the ultimate luxury of the corporate elite. They take the profit and they leave the society to deal with the casualty. Saturn's years in the wilderness were a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance. He was shot, addicted, and living in squalor. Yet the fundamental toughness forged by Killer Kowalski and the U.S. Army refused to let his heart stop beating. The turning point did not arrive via a dramatic rescue. It was a slow, agonizing crawl back to the light. Eventually, the exhaustion of the streets outweighed the grip of the chemicals. Saturn sought help. It is incredibly difficult for a fiercely proud, independent man to admit absolute defeat, but Saturn did. He reached out to his family, he entered a rehabilitation facility, and he began the harrowing process of detoxifying his brain and his body. When Perry Saturn finally resurfaced in the public eye around 2012, the wrestling world was stunned. He looked older, battered, and heavily tattooed with the scars of his survival. He did not return demanding apologies or pointing fingers at the executives who had wronged him. Instead, he spoke with absolute, brutal honesty about his own failures. He owned his addiction. He spoke candidly about the nightmare of homelessness and the lingering, terrifying effects of traumatic brain injury, TBI, the memory loss, the mood swings, and the constant headaches caused by years of concussions in the ring. The story of Perry Saturn is one of the most harrowing and profound narratives in the history of modern entertainment. It strips away the neon lights, the scripted triumphs, and the corporate marketing, exposing the raw, bloody machinery that operates beneath the floorboards of the industry. World Championship Wrestling and the World Wrestling Federation were systems built to extract value from the human body. They rewarded political compliance over raw talent. They demanded that brilliant mechanics lay down and sacrifice their dignity to protect the fragile egos of incompetent stars. When Saturn refused to quietly accept the injustice of his environment, when he demanded that his craftsmanship be respected, the system tried to break him. They ordered him to wear a dress. They ordered him to fall in love with a mop. They tried to turn a legitimate, battle-tested warrior into a corporate jester. But the true measure of a man's legacy is not found in how a corporation chooses to write his script. It is found in how he responds when the script is torn away. When the cameras stopped rolling and the billionaires stopped paying him, Perry Saturn was presented with a real-world crisis. He did not hesitate. He took 2 bullets to save the life of a complete stranger. That single untelevised act of raw courage permanently overrides every humiliating gimmick the executives ever forced him to perform. It proved that his integrity was not a character he played on television. It was the marrow in his bones. He survived the malice of corporate politics. He survived a point-blank assassination attempt, and he survived the absolute darkest depths of chemical addiction and homelessness. Perry Saturn stands today not as a broken casualty of the wrestling business, but as a living monument to human resilience. He is the ultimate proof that while a corrupt system can steal your livelihood, humiliate your name, and discard your broken body, it can never entirely extinguish the soul of a true mechanic. He walked through the fire, and he walked out alive.